To talk a lot more and break down what we just sort of learned there, I want to bring into the conversation legal analyst Nima Rahmani. Nima, thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. Of course, when it comes to some of these SNAP issues, it really hits home for people. We were just listening into that press conference with that man talking about he's disabled, he's on a fixed income, and these SNAP benefits are not coming. What did we just now learn through the court system as the government still remains shut down at this hour?
Thanks for having me, Christina. And like you said, more than 42 million Americans do receive these benefits, 1 in 8 people in the United States. So this is a big deal for a lot of folks. So let's talk about the latest developments today in the legal case. So yesterday, the judge, like you said, ordered the federal government, specifically the Department of Agriculture, to dip into another pool of money. It's called Section 32 WIC, commonly referred to as women, infants, and children. So this is a separate pool of money. There's $23 billion there.
Okay, hold on, because this just happened, and it's a really big deal. The Supreme Court just denied Trump's emergency request for a stay. Now, I know that might sound like a bunch of legal jargon, so let me break down why this matters and why Trump's legal team is probably freaking out right now. Basically, Trump's attorneys went to the Supreme Court and said, hey, we need you to hit the pause button on this lower court ruling. We need an emergency stay that stops everything while we figure this out. And the Supreme Court looked at that request and said, no, not gonna happen. The appeals court ruling stands, and that means all the stuff Trump was trying to stop, all the enforcement actions, all the compliance measures, all of it can move forward immediately. No delays, no protection, no emergency rescue from the highest court in the land. That's a massive legal setback, and it's happening at literally the worst possible time for Trump. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
We know the SNAP program costs the federal government approximately $8.5 to $9 billion a month. So this additional money could potentially fund the program through the end of the year. Now, the federal government is saying that this is unlawful. You can't force the government to pull from one pool of money to pay for another. Now, this Section 32 program, it was funded by 1932 congressional law called the Agriculture Adjustment Act. And the second argument that the government is making is that this is a judge telling Congress to appropriate funds and to spend money. And the nonprofits that sued in the cities, they said, no, this money has already been apportioned. It just has to be spent. And the USDA is refusing to do so.
So what does this actually mean in practical terms? Well, when you get denied an emergency stay by the Supreme Court, it means lower courts and government agencies can now move forward with whatever they were planning to do. In Trump's case, that could include asset freezes, forced disclosures, financial sanctions, document production, all the things his legal team has been desperately trying to prevent or delay. And now there's nothing stopping those enforcement actions from happening. The Supreme Court basically said the lower court got it right, we're not intervening, deal with it. And for someone who's been using every legal maneuver possible to delay and obstruct, that's a nightmare scenario. Because once enforcement actions start, once assets get frozen, or documents get turned over, or sanctions get imposed, you can't just undo that easily. The damage is done. And here's what makes this even more significant. This isn't some random district court judge making a decision that Trump can appeal up the chain. This is the Supreme Court saying we're not going to help you. That's the end of the line. That's as high as you can go in the American legal system. So when the Supreme Court denies your emergency request, that's it. Game over. The ruling stands, and Trump's legal team has to figure out how to deal with the consequences. Now, the background here is important. Trump had lost at the appeals court level. The First Circuit denied his request to stay a district court decision. So he went to the Supreme Court hoping they'd intervene, hoping they'd give him the emergency relief he was asking for. And the justices said no. They declined to intervene. They let the lower ruling remain in effect. That tells you something about how the Supreme Court views Trump's legal arguments in this case. They're not buying it. They're not seeing grounds for emergency intervention. And look, the Supreme Court doesn't grant emergency stays lightly. They're supposed to be for situations where there's irreparable harm that can't be fixed later, where the law clearly favors the party asking for relief, where the balance of equities tipped strongly in their favor. Apparently, Trump's request didn't meet those standards. Apparently, the justices looked at his arguments and said this doesn't warrant emergency intervention. Let the lower court ruling stand. That's a really strong signal about the weakness of Trump's position. Because if the Supreme Court thought he had a good case, if they thought there was serious legal error below, they would have granted the stay. The fact that they didn't tells you they think the lower courts got it right. So what are the immediate consequences? Well, according to legal experts, Trump could now face immediate enforcement actions. We're talking about possible fines, asset freezes, forced compliance with court orders, all without any further delay or protection from higher courts. The decision means federal agencies and states can continue implementing court orders, including financial sanctions and document production requirements, without interruption. That's huge, because Trump's entire legal strategy has been built around delay, around using appeals and emergency motions to push things down the road, to buy time, to avoid immediate consequences. But now that strategy just hit a brick wall. The Supreme Court said no more delays, the ruling stands, enforcement can proceed. And this is happening across multiple fronts. The Supreme Court's denial affects several high-profile disputes involving fraud penalties, benefits programs, executive actions, all hitting critical junctures in courtrooms nationwide. So it's not just one case that's affected, it's potentially multiple cases where Trump was hoping for Supreme Court intervention and didn't get it. That multiplies the impact. That means enforcement actions could be coming from multiple directions simultaneously. Federal agencies can move forward, state attorneys general can move forward, lower courts can start imposing penalties and sanctions without worrying that the Supreme Court is going to swoop in and stop them. The political implications here are also massive. Trump is serving as president while dealing with all these legal battles. And now the Supreme Court, which includes 3 justices he appointed, just told him no on an emergency request. That's going to fuel questions about his legal strategy, about the strength of his cases, about whether he's actually been getting bad legal advice this whole time. His opponents are going to point to this and say, see, even the Supreme Court won't bail him out. Even the highest court in the land thinks the lower courts got it right. And that narrative that even Trump's own appointees won't give him special treatment, that's politically damaging. It undermines the claim that he's being unfairly targeted by partisan judges. So buckle up, because we're going to break down exactly what this Supreme Court denial means, why Trump's legal team is in crisis mode, and what enforcement actions could be coming next. This is a major turning point in Trump's legal battles, and it's not turning in his favor. The Supreme Court just closed the door on his emergency appeal strategy, and now he's going to have to face the consequences of lower court rulings without any protection from above. This story is huge, and the fallout is just beginning. All right, so let's dig deeper into what actually happened here and why it matters so much for Trump's overall legal situation. Because this isn't just about one emergency stay request getting denied. This is about the collapse of a key legal strategy that Trump has relied on for years. So here's the sequence of events. Trump lost at the district court level, whatever the case was about, and we're talking about multiple potential cases here involving fraud penalties, executive actions, benefits programs. The district court ruled against him. So his legal team appealed to the First Circuit Court of Appeals and also asked for a stay, basically saying, hey, don't let this ruling take effect while we're appealing it. And the First Circuit said, no, we're denying your request for a stay. The district court ruling stands and can be enforced. Now, normally when you lose at the circuit court level, you can petition the Supreme Court. But there are different types of Supreme Court review. There's the normal appeals process, which takes months and has no guarantee the court will even hear your case. And then there's the emergency stay, which is what Trump's team requested here. An emergency stay is supposed to be for urgent situations where immediate irreparable harm will occur if the lower court ruling is allowed to take effect. It's supposed to be rare. It's supposed to be for exceptional circumstances. But in recent years, emergency stay requests have become much more common, especially in politically charged cases. And Trump has used this strategy repeatedly, running to the Supreme Court, asking for emergency relief whenever lower courts rule against him. But here's the thing. The Supreme Court just said no. They declined to intervene. They let the First Circuit's denial stand. And that's significant for several reasons. First, it tells you that the justices didn't see grounds for emergency intervention. They didn't think Trump demonstrated irreparable harm. They didn't think the law clearly favored his position. They didn't think the balance of equities tipped in his favor. All of those are factors the court considers when deciding whether to grant an emergency stay, and apparently Trump's request failed on all counts. That's a pretty strong indication that his legal arguments in this case are weak, that the lower courts got it right, and that there's no reason to hit the pause button on enforcement. Second, it shows that even a Supreme Court with 3 Trump-appointed justices isn't going to give him special treatment on emergency requests. That's politically significant because it undermines Trump's narrative that he's being persecuted by partisan judges, while conservative justices would protect him if they could. Well, they could have granted this stay, and they chose not to. That tells you something about how they view his legal claims. Now, what are the practical consequences of this denial? Well, it means that whatever the district court ordered can now be enforced immediately. If the order was for Trump to turn over financial records, those records have to be turned over. If the order was for asset freezes, those freezes can be implemented. If the order was for sanctions or penalties, those can be imposed. There's no further delay mechanism. There's no higher court to appeal to. The Supreme Court has spoken, and their answer was no. Legal experts are warning that Trump could face immediate enforcement actions. And when they say immediate, they mean it. Courts and agencies don't have to wait anymore. They can move forward with whatever compliance measures or penalties were ordered. That could include forced document production, financial penalties, asset freezes, all sorts of enforcement mechanisms that Trump has been desperately trying to avoid. And here's why that's so devastating for his legal strategy. Trump's entire approach to litigation has been built around delay. File motions, seek stays, appeal everything. Use procedural mechanisms to push things down the road as far as possible. The goal is to drag things out so long that either the other side gives up, or circumstances change, or political winds shift. But that strategy only works if courts keep granting you stays and delays. Once courts start saying no, once the Supreme Court declines to intervene, that whole strategy collapses. And we're seeing that collapse happen in real time right now. The Supreme Court's denial means Trump can't use the emergency stay route anymore, at least not in this case, and potentially in similar cases going forward. Because once the Supreme Court denies an emergency stay request, that sets a precedent of sorts. It tells lower courts that the Supreme Court isn't going to second-guess their decisions in these types of cases. It tells other litigants that Trump isn't getting special treatment. It tells everyone involved that the normal enforcement process can proceed without fear of Supreme Court intervention. Now let's talk about the specific types of enforcement actions Trump might be facing. According to the sources, this denial affects multiple disputes. We're talking about fraud penalties from civil cases. We're talking about benefits programs and executive actions that courts have ruled against. We're talking about compliance measures and document production requirements. Each of those carries different potential consequences. For fraud penalties, we're talking about actual money that Trump might have to pay. We're talking about asset freezes that prevent him from moving money around or selling properties. We're talking about monitors who could be appointed to oversee his business operations. These aren't theoretical consequences. These are real enforcement mechanisms that courts use in fraud cases. And now that the Supreme Court has declined to intervene, those mechanisms can be deployed. For document production requirements, we're talking about Trump having to turn over financial records, emails, communications, all the stuff his legal team has been fighting to keep private. Once those documents are produced, they become part of the public court record. They can be used in other cases. They can be scrutinized by investigators and journalists. There's no taking that back once it happens. For executive actions that courts have ruled against, we're talking about federal agencies and state governments being able to continue implementing programs or policies that Trump tried to block or change. The Supreme Court's denial means those agencies don't have to wait anymore. They can proceed with implementation while any appeals play out. That's a big deal for administrative law and executive power because it means courts are willing to constrain presidential actions even when the president asks for emergency relief. The broader legal implications here are also really important. This Supreme Court denial is part of a pattern we're seeing where courts, including conservative courts, are refusing to give Trump special treatment. They're applying normal legal standards. They're holding him to the same rules as everyone else. And when his legal arguments don't meet those standards, they're ruling against him. That's significant because it suggests that Trump's legal problems aren't just about partisan judges or political prosecutions. They're about actual legal violations that courts across the ideological spectrum are recognizing. And here's something else to consider. The Supreme Court's denial came quickly. They didn't sit on this request for weeks deliberating. They looked at it and said no, pretty much immediately. That suggests the justices didn't see this as a close call. They didn't think Trump's arguments warranted serious consideration for emergency relief. That's a really strong signal about the weakness of his legal position. Because even when the Supreme Court denies cases, they usually take some time to review the arguments. But when they deny quickly, it means the request was clearly without merit. So what does Trump do now? Well, he can still pursue normal appeals through the court system. He can still try to get cases heard on their merits, but he can't use emergency stays to block enforcement in the meantime. He's going to have to deal with the consequences of lower court rulings as they happen, not months or years down the road after endless delays. That fundamentally changes the calculus. for his legal team. It also changes the calculus for prosecutors and plaintiffs in other cases. They now know that Trump can't just run to the Supreme Court and get automatic protection from enforcement. They know that if they win at the district and circuit court levels, those wins are likely to stick. That emboldens them to push harder, to seek more aggressive remedies, to move cases forward more quickly. And all of that puts more pressure on Trump and his already struggling legal team. The timing here is also really significant. We're in the middle of Trump's presidency. He's dealing with multiple legal battles simultaneously, and now the Supreme Court has denied him emergency relief, opening the door for immediate enforcement actions across multiple cases. That's not just a legal problem, that's a political and governance problem. How do you effectively serve as president when courts are freezing your assets, forcing you to produce documents, and imposing sanctions? How do you maintain political support when the Supreme Court, including justices you appointed, is refusing to protect you from enforcement? These aren't just legal questions, they're existential questions about Trump's ability to function in his role. Okay, let's break this down into the essential points because there's a lot of legal complexity here, but the core story is actually pretty straightforward. The Supreme Court denied Trump's emergency stay request. The appeals court ruling stands. Enforcement can proceed immediately. That's the headline, but let's unpack what it really means. First, this is a major defeat for Trump's legal strategy. His whole approach has been built on delay, on using procedural mechanisms to push enforcement down the road. Emergency stays are a key part of that strategy. You lose in lower courts, you ask for a stay while you appeal. You try to freeze everything in place until higher courts can review. But the Supreme Court just said no to that strategy. They declined to intervene. They let the lower court ruling stand. That means Trump can't rely on emergency Supreme Court intervention to save him anymore, at least not in this type of case. Second, the practical consequences are immediate and serious. According to legal experts, Trump now faces the possibility of immediate enforcement actions. Asset freezes, financial penalties, forced document production, compliance measures, all of it can move forward without further delay. Courts and agencies that were waiting for Supreme Court guidance now know they can proceed. That's a green light for enforcement. And once those actions start, they're very hard to reverse. You can't unfreeze assets easily. You can't take back documents once they're produced. The damage is done, and Trump has to live with the consequences. Third, this denial affects multiple cases and disputes. We're not just talking about one isolated legal battle. The Supreme Court's decision has implications for fraud penalties, executive actions, benefits programs, potentially multiple areas where Trump has been seeking emergency relief. That multiplies the impact. That means enforcement could be coming from multiple directions simultaneously, creating a cascade of legal problems all at once. Now, let's talk about why the Supreme Court denied this request, because that tells us something important about Trump's legal position. When the Supreme Court considers an emergency stay, they look at several factors. Is there irreparable harm that can't be fixed later? Does the law clearly favor the party seeking the stay? Does the balance of equities tip in their favor? Would granting the stay harm others or the public interest? Apparently, Trump's request failed on these counts. The justices didn't think he demonstrated irreparable harm. They didn't think the law clearly favored his position. They didn't think granting relief was warranted. That's a pretty damning assessment of his legal arguments. Because remember, this is an emergency request. The standard is supposed to be, are there exceptional circumstances that require immediate Supreme Court intervention? And the answer from the justices was no. And here's what makes this particularly significant. 3 of the current Supreme Court justices were appointed by Trump. So this isn't about a liberal court being hostile to him. This is a court with a conservative majority, including his own appointees, looking at his request and saying it doesn't meet the standards for emergency relief. That undermines any narrative that Trump is being persecuted by partisan judges. If even conservative justices won't give him emergency protection, that suggests his legal arguments genuinely lack merit. Now, what about the political implications? Well, they're huge. Trump is serving as president while fighting multiple legal battles, and now the Supreme Court has publicly denied him emergency relief. That's going to dominate headlines. That's going to fuel his political opponents. That's going to create questions among some supporters about whether his legal problems are more serious than they've been led to believe. When the highest court in the land refuses to protect you from enforcement, that's hard to spin as a witch hunt or political persecution. The denial also affects Trump's relationship with the federal judiciary more broadly. Judges at all levels are watching what the Supreme Court does. When the Supreme Court declines to intervene, that signals to lower court judges that they can proceed with enforcement without worrying about getting reversed. It tells them that Trump isn't getting special treatment, that normal legal standards apply, and that's going to make judges more willing to rule against Trump in future cases, more willing to impose sanctions and penalties, more willing to deny his motions for delays and stays, because they now know the Supreme Court isn't going to second guess those decisions. Let's also talk about what this means for Trump's legal team. They just suffered a major defeat at the highest level. They went to the Supreme Court with an emergency request and got shot down. That's embarrassing professionally. That's a sign that their legal strategy isn't working, and it puts enormous pressure on them to figure out a new approach, because the old approach of seeking emergency stays has just been shut down. And remember, Trump's legal team is already in crisis. We've been covering stories about lawyers quitting, about ethical concerns, about struggles to maintain a stable defense team. Now add a Supreme Court denial on top of that. That's another blow to morale, another reason for lawyers to question whether representing Trump is worth the professional risk, because if the Supreme Court won't even grant emergency relief, what hope is there for prevailing on the merits? What's the path to victory? Those are questions Trump's lawyers are going to be asking themselves right now. The enforcement actions that can now proceed are also varied and serious. For fraud penalties, we're talking about actual monetary judgments that Trump will have to pay. Courts can seize assets to satisfy those judgments. They can impose liens. They can garnish income. These are real financial consequences that affect Trump's net worth and his business empire. For document production, we're talking about Trump having to turn over records he's been fighting to keep secret, financial statements, tax returns, emails, communications, all of it potentially becoming part of the public record. That's not just embarrassing, that's potentially incriminating if those documents reveal wrongdoing. For compliance measures related to executive actions, we're talking about Trump having to follow court orders about how his administration implements certain policies. That constrains his power as president, that limits his ability to act unilaterally. That's a check on executive authority that he's been trying to avoid. Now, can Trump still appeal these cases through normal channels? Yes, he can still seek review on the merits. But he can't block enforcement while those appeals play out. He's going to have to deal with the consequences in real time, not after years of delays. That's a huge change in the dynamic. And here's the thing. Once enforcement starts, it creates its own momentum. Assets get frozen. That affects Trump's ability to fund his legal defense. Documents get produced. Prosecutors use them to strengthen their cases. Sanctions get imposed. That damages Trump's credibility in court. All of these enforcement actions make it harder for Trump to fight back effectively. They weaken his position in ongoing battles. They create new vulnerabilities that prosecutors and plaintiffs can exploit. The broader pattern here is also really important to recognize. This Supreme Court denial is part of a series of legal setbacks Trump has been experiencing. Courts at multiple levels are ruling against him. Judges are rejecting his legal arguments. His defense teams are falling apart. His emergency stay requests are getting denied. All of that adds up to a legal strategy in collapse. And when your legal strategy collapses, your options become very limited, very quickly. So what's the bottom line? The Supreme Court denied Trump's emergency stay request. The appeals court ruling stands. Enforcement can proceed immediately across multiple cases and disputes. Trump faces the possibility of asset freezes, financial penalties, forced document production, and various other compliance measures. His legal team has lost a key tool in their delay strategy. And the highest court in the land, including 3 justices he appointed, has said they're not going to intervene to protect him. That's a massive legal defeat. That's a turning point in Trump's legal battles, and it's happening right now in the middle of his presidency. The implications are enormous, the consequences are immediate, and the fallout is just beginning. Because once courts know they can enforce against Trump without Supreme Court interference, they're going to start moving aggressively. Prosecutors are going to push harder. Plaintiffs are going to seek more aggressive remedies. And Trump is going to be on the defensive, trying to deal with enforcement actions he can no longer delay or avoid. This is what happens when your legal strategy runs out of road. This is what happens when courts at every level, including the Supreme Court, stop giving you the benefit of the doubt. And this is what happens when you rely on delay tactics rather than strong legal arguments on the merits. Eventually, the delays run out. Eventually, the courts say no more. And eventually, you have to face the consequences. Trump is at that point now. The Supreme Court has said no more emergency stays. Enforcement is moving forward, and he's going to have to deal with it. Stay tuned, because as these enforcement actions start rolling in, this story is going to get a lot more intense. We're watching a legal strategy collapse in real time, and the consequences are going to be severe.